She carried books like others carried burdens, with quiet determination that invited mockery from those who feared what they couldn't understand. The commander's eyes had seen war, death, and destruction, but nothing prepared him for the moment they fixed upon her tattoo. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Dr. Liana Hallberg squinted against the merciless, late summer sun as she crossed Fort Dalen's dusty courtyard. Her arms cradled a stack of weathered books and notebooks, threatening to topple with each careful step. From the shade of a nearby barracks, a cluster of soldiers watched her approach. "Hey, Professor, the library's that way," one called out, triggering a wave of laughter. Another cupped his hands around his mouth. "We don't read much here, just shoot things." Liana maintained her steady pace, her expression betraying nothing of the anxiety churning beneath her composed exterior. 6 years since her last military assignment, and the familiar weight of scrutiny already pressed down on her shoulders. The linguist adjusted her grip on the books, feeling the spine of her annotated dictionary dig into her forearm. The central checkpoint loomed ahead. A concrete structure flanked by armed guards whose eyes tracked her movement with professional suspicion. Liana's reassignment orders sat folded in her pocket, deliberately vague in their wording. Linguistic specialist required for ongoing operations. No mention of echo cipher. No acknowledgement of her past role. Identification, the guard demanded, his accent thick with the regional dialect of this fictional Eastern European border region. She balanced her books against her hip and produced her credentials with practiced efficiency. "Dr. Hallberg, expected today." Inside the base, the atmosphere shifted from open hostility to controlled chaos. Multilingual commands echoed through corridors. Orders barked in 3 different languages, sometimes mid-sentence. Announcements blared over an aging speaker system, their clarity lost to static and competing noise. The constant clatter of boots against concrete created a military percussion that Liana had almost forgotten. A junior officer led her through a maze of hallways, past rooms where intelligence personnel hunched over computer terminals. Their conversations hushed as she passed, eyes lingering on her stack of books rather than her face. "Your quarters," the officer said, gesturing to a sparse room with a single bed and metal desk. "Briefing at 1600 hours." Liana set her books down carefully, arranging them in a precise order that would seem random to any observer. She unpacked her battered duffel bag, placing each item with deliberate care. The linguist caught her reflection in the small mirror above the sink. Tired eyes, hair pulled back too tightly, the weight of secrets visible only to those who knew where to look. From somewhere in the distance, she heard laughter. The same soldiers, perhaps, still amused by the woman who brought books to a military base. Liana allowed herself a small, private smile. They had no idea what those books contained, or what she could do with words alone. The line at the checkpoint stretched longer than usual as Dr. Liana Hallberg shifted her stack of weathered books to free one hand. She reached for her identification badge, tucked inside her faded uniform pocket. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Fort Dalen's dusty courtyard, making the wait even more unbearable. "ID, please," the guard demanded, his tone bored and mechanical. "Purpose of visit to restricted areas?" "Research assignment," Liana replied, sliding her credentials across the metal counter. As she extended her arm, her sleeve rode up several inches, exposing a portion of her forearm. There, etched in black ink against her pale skin, was an intricate glyph, a series of interlocking symbols that resembled no known alphabet. The marking wasn't particularly large, but its presence was unmistakable. The guard barely glanced at it, more concerned with matching her face to the photo. But Commander Ayers, passing through the checkpoint with 2 junior officers, stopped mid-sentence when his eyes caught the exposed tattoo. "Wait," he commanded, his authoritative voice cutting through the ambient noise of the base. The commander approached slowly, his gaze fixed on Liana's arm. The color drained from his face as though he'd seen a ghost. "Where did you get that?" Ayers asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Gone was the commanding presence. In its place stood a man visibly shaken. Liana met his gaze steadily. "It's personal, sir." "That's not what I asked, Doctor." The way he emphasized her title made it clear he knew exactly who she was. The soldiers who had been mocking her book collection just minutes earlier fell silent, their attention captured by this unexpected confrontation. The atmosphere shifted palpably as everyone sensed the sudden tension between the linguist and their commander. "Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private," Liana suggested quietly, aware of the growing audience. Commander Ayers seemed to remember himself, straightening his posture and regaining some composure. "My office, now." He turned to the checkpoint guard. "Clear her for all areas except weapons storage and communications hub." The guard's eyes widened in surprise. "Sir, protocol requires." "Override protocol. Authorization Ayers 7-4 Alpha." The commander's tone left no room for argument. As Liana gathered her books, she noticed how the mocking soldiers now regarded her with cautious curiosity. Whatever power that simple tattoo held had transformed her status in seconds, from an object of ridicule to someone who could make their commander pale with recognition. The black-inked glyph throbbed slightly against her skin, as if awakened by acknowledgement after years of dormancy. Liana knew this moment would change everything. The past she'd tried to bury had finally caught up with her at Fort Dalen. Commander Ayers gripped Dr. Liana Hellberg's arm with unexpected force, steering her away from the checkpoint and curious onlookers. His knuckles whitened against her battered uniform as he pulled her into a cramped, windowless office that smelled of stale coffee and classified paper. "Sit," he ordered, his voice barely controlled. The single metal chair scraped against concrete as Liana settled herself, maintaining the same calm composure that had carried her across the courtyard minutes earlier. The commander paced like a caged animal, occasionally glancing at her tattoo with a mixture of recognition and dread. "That symbol shouldn't exist outside sealed archives," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He snatched a secure communication device from his desk, barking coded phrases into it while keeping his eyes fixed on the linguist. Within minutes, 2 intelligence officers arrived with weathered file boxes. They spread decades-old documents across the table, comparing faded photographs to the black ink on Liana's forearm. The tension in the room thickened as security clearances were verified and cross-referenced. "When did you serve with Echo Cipher?" Ayers finally asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You know I can't answer that," Liana replied, her first words since being detained. "The same protocols that bind you bind me." For 3 hours, the questioning continued. Encrypted calls were made to unnamed superiors, while Liana sat motionless, her books still clutched to her chest like armor. Outside, rumors spread through the base like wildfire. The new arrival with academic credentials had somehow terrified the unflappable Commander Ayers. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything changed. The commander returned from a private call, his face ashen but resolved. He dismissed the other officers with a sharp gesture. "Dr. Hallberg," he said formally, sliding a new identification badge across the desk. "Your security clearance has been upgraded, effective immediately. You'll join my personal intelligence team." Liana examined the badge, noting its rare classification level. "May I ask what changed your mind, Commander?" "Not my mind," he replied cryptically. "Orders from above. Someone wants your particular expertise." When she emerged from detainment, the transformation in her status was impossible to miss. The same soldiers who had mocked her arrival now snapped to attention as she passed. Intelligence staff who had ignored her existence suddenly found reasons to introduce themselves. By evening, Liana was escorted to new quarters adjacent to the command center, a privilege reserved for the commander's most trusted advisors. As the door closed behind her, she finally allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The wheels had been set in motion, exactly as planned. Liana Hallberg sat on the edge of her narrow bunk, eyes fixed on the bare concrete wall of her newly assigned quarters. The space was Spartan, a metal desk, a small bookshelf, and a locker barely large enough for her weathered duffel bag. Fort Dalen's utilitarian design left little room for comfort, but that suited her fine. Comfort had never been part of the Echo Cipher protocol. She rolled up her sleeve, tracing the black-inked glyph on her forearm with practiced fingers. The tattoo wasn't merely decorative, it was a living cipher key, a remnant from a program the military had officially scrubbed from existence. The linguist remembered the countless hours spent crafting messages designed to mislead, manipulate, and misdirect. Echo Cipher had weaponized language itself, turning dialects, accents, and cultural nuances into tools of psychological warfare. "We were ghosts writing ghost messages," she whispered to herself, the words hanging in the stale air. Liana unpacked her books, arranging them meticulously on the shelf. Each volume had been hollowed out, containing layers of cipher wheels and annotated intelligence. These weren't just texts. They were her arsenal, knowledge preserved from battles fought in silence. The guilt gnawed at her as she recalled faces of colleagues who hadn't survived the program's sudden termination. Some had been eliminated. Others had taken their own lives, unable to live with what they'd done. Yet here she was, still breathing, still carrying the burden of survival. She powered up her communication device, scanning through encrypted base transmissions with growing unease. The patterns were unmistakable, subtle linguistic markers embedded in routine communications, dialectical variations that wouldn't register to untrained eyes. Someone was using Echo Cipher techniques again, perhaps under a new name, a new program. The linguist's hands trembled slightly as she decoded a fragment. The methodology was eerily familiar. It was her methodology, her fingerprints all over the encryption. Had they resurrected her old algorithms? Or worse, had they found her notebooks? Outside, boots clattered down the corridor as soldiers changed shifts. Liana quickly shut down the device and slid it beneath her pillow. The walls of Fort Dalen had ears, and she couldn't afford to show her hand too early. She pressed her palm against the tattoo, feeling its phantom heat. The glyph represented both her shame and her power, the key to a language system that could either prevent catastrophe or cause it. Commander Ayres had recognized it immediately. The question was, what did he intend to do with that knowledge? Sleep would not come easily tonight. Not with the echoes of Echo Cipher whispering through the encrypted channels of Fort Dalen, calling her back to a past she had desperately tried to leave behind. The mess hall was unusually quiet that evening. Dr. Liana Hallberg sat alone at a corner table, her food barely touched as she lost herself in the worn pages of an ancient linguistics text. She preferred these moments of solitude, when the constant vigilance could be momentarily forgotten. "Dostoevsky?" came a voice, breaking her concentration. Liana looked up to find Corporal Esme Routh standing beside her table, tray in hand, her uniform crisp despite the late hour. The junior officer's eyes sparkled with genuine interest. "Chomsky, actually," Liana replied, surprised by the interruption. Few at Fort Dalen approached her voluntarily, especially after the incident with Commander Ayres. "Mind if I join you?" Esme asked, already sliding into the seat opposite. "Everyone else here thinks books are just for propping up wobbly tables." Against her better judgment, Liana found herself smiling. The corporal's straightforward manner was refreshing after weeks of veiled suspicion and sidelong glances. Their conversation flowed naturally from linguistics to literature. Esme revealed a surprising depth of knowledge about classical texts, quoting passages from works Liana hadn't discussed with anyone in years. For the first time since arriving at the base, She felt the rigid walls of her isolation begin to crack. "You remind me of my brother," Esme said suddenly, her voice dropping. "He was always buried in books too, could speak 4 languages by 23. Was? Liana asked carefully. The young officer's eyes clouded. He volunteered for a special program 5 years ago. Echo Cipher, they called it. Classified linguistic operations. She traced a pattern on the table with her finger. The official report said training accident, but his letters before that? He seemed afraid. Liana's blood ran cold. Her fingers instinctively moved to cover her tattoo, though her sleeve already concealed it. "I'm sorry," she managed, fighting to keep her expression neutral. "Sometimes I think that's why I joined up," Esme continued, "to understand what happened to him." An alarm sounded in Liana's mind. This connection was dangerous for both of them. Yet something about the corporal's earnest grief awakened a protective instinct she thought long dead. "Books were his weapons too," Esme said, nodding toward Liana. Yet for the first time in years, the linguist felt something dangerously close to hope. Dr. Liana Hallberg's fingers hovered over the stack of intercepted communiques, her breath catching as recognition dawned. The patterns were unmistakable, subtle shifts in syntax, deliberate grammatical errors that formed a secondary meaning when read by trained eyes. These weren't random communications. They were coded messages using techniques she herself had designed years ago. "This can't be happening," she whispered, spreading the papers across her desk. The linguist had spent 3 nights reviewing transmissions between Allied bases, and what began as routine analysis had transformed into something far more disturbing. She traced a phrase that appeared innocuous, a request for medical supplies, but the dialectical nuance suggested troop movements instead. Another message about weather conditions contained embedded commands when read with the right phonetic emphasis. These were echo cipher techniques, her techniques, now being deployed under someone else's authority. Liana pulled her hair back, fighting the chill that ran down her spine. The multilingual tensions of the region made it perfect for such manipulation. A mistranslated word here, a shifted meaning there. Entire units could be redirected without realizing they were being played. In one transmission, she spotted a pattern that exploited the differences between northern and southern dialects, creating plausible deniability while conveying completely different orders to different recipients. She had pioneered this approach during her echo cipher days, calling it dialectical divergence. The communication device on her desk buzzed. Commander Ayers wanted her preliminary report by morning. What could she possibly tell him? That someone was using her playbook? That echo cipher, the program they had supposedly dismantled, was resurfacing in a new form? She reached for her encrypted notebook, documenting the patterns with trembling hands. The base around her hummed with ordinary activity while she sat frozen, confronting ghosts she thought she'd buried. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Esme said, appearing at her doorway with 2 steaming cups. The corporal set a cup beside Liana's scattered papers, her eyes curious but respectful. Liana quickly covered the most damning evidence with her arm. "Just working through some translations," she replied, forcing a smile. After Esme left, Liana returned to the messages, meticulously mapping each pattern. Someone with intimate knowledge of echo cipher was orchestrating this, someone who knew exactly how the program had operated, someone who might even know about her role in creating these very techniques. She slid the papers into a hollowed copy of an old linguistics textbook and locked it in her desk drawer. Tomorrow, she would have to make a decision: report her findings and expose her past, or investigate further on her own. Either way, the quiet life she'd hoped for at Fort Dalen was unraveling, one coded message at a time. Dr. Liana Hallberg stood at the edge of the border checkpoint, watching as 2 groups of villagers faced off across an invisible line. The assignment had come directly from Commander Ayers, a humanitarian mission that seemed suspiciously convenient. She knew better than to believe in coincidences. They won't listen to military personnel. She told the small contingent of soldiers accompanying her, "Let me handle this." The eastern village spoke a dialect that had nearly vanished after decades of political suppression. The western group used a regional variant that borrowed heavily from 3 neighboring languages. Both were arguing over water rights to a small reservoir that straddled the border, a dispute that had already led to 3 violent confrontations. Liana approached slowly, her hands empty of weapons, but her mind armed with something far more powerful. She greeted the eastern village elder in his native tongue, using inflections that hadn't been heard in official capacity for generations. The old man's eyes widened. "You speak the old way," he said, his weathered face softening. She turned to the western group and switched dialects seamlessly, explaining the eastern village's concerns without losing the cultural nuances that translation often sacrificed. For 2 hours, he moved between groups, building a linguistic bridge where military force would have only deepened the divide. Corporal Esme Routh watched from a distance, fascinated by how the linguists diffused tensions with nothing but words. The young officer had never seen anyone command such respect without a weapon or uniform insignia. By sunset, both villages had agreed to a water-sharing arrangement. The soldiers who had expected conflict stood awkwardly, their presence rendered unnecessary by Liana's methods. "I didn't know we had specialists like you," one lieutenant commented as they packed up their equipment. "You don't," Liana replied simply. Back at Fort Dalen, word of her success spread quickly. In the mess hall, conversations hushed when she entered. The intelligence officers who had dismissed her now studied her with newfound interest. "They're wondering what else you can do," Esme told her over dinner. "The commander's getting questions." Liana nodded. That was the point. Was it? The corporal leaned closer. Or was this a test? The linguist traced the outline of her tattoo beneath her sleeve. Every move in this game had multiple purposes. Her humanitarian success had demonstrated her value, but also exposed her capabilities to whoever was watching. Commander Ayres summoned her that evening. "Impressive work," he said, sliding a folder across his desk. "But now they're asking questions I can't answer." "Perhaps that's the point," Liana replied, meeting his gaze steadily. They both knew the real operation had just begun. The fluorescent lights flickered as Dr. Liana Halberg approached her quarters, her mind still processing the day's communications analysis. Something felt wrong before she even touched the door handle. A subtle displacement in the air, perhaps, or the too perfect silence of the corridor. When she entered, her suspicions crystallized into cold reality. Her quarters had been methodically ransacked, drawers pulled open, bedding disturbed, but with a precision that spoke of training rather than rage. Liana's eyes immediately darted to her small bookshelf, where the hollow sensation in her stomach confirmed what she already knew. Her annotated copy of The Art of War, the leather-bound edition with the faded spine, was missing. "Selective theft," she whispered to the empty room, running her fingers across the dust-free rectangle where the book had stood. The linguist carefully examined her other possessions. Nothing else was taken. Not her military-issued communication device. Not the small box of Eastern European currency she kept for emergencies. Not even the other hollowed books that appeared valuable. Only someone who knew exactly what they were looking for would have targeted that specific volume. Inside its carefully carved center, she had hidden 3 cipher wheels, layered encryption keys, and handwritten notes on Echo Cipher's dormant communication channels. The intelligence officer had meticulously collected this cache over years. Insurance against the day she feared was now arriving. Liana sat on the edge of her bed, fingers absently tracing the tattoo on her forearm. Whoever had broken in hadn't just stolen a book, they'd taken the master key to her past. The invasion felt intimate, as if someone had reached directly into her memories. She considered reporting the break-in to Commander Ayres, but hesitated. The base commander's reaction to her tattoo weeks ago suggested he knew more than he admitted about Echo Cipher. Could he be behind this? Or was it Latch, reaching out from the shadows? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Corporal Esme Routh stood in the doorway, her expression shifting from friendly to concerned as she surveyed the disrupted room. "What happened?" the junior officer asked, stepping inside and closing the door. "Someone who knows exactly who I am," Liana replied, carefully choosing her words. "And what I keep." Esme's eyes widened slightly as she understood the implications. "The art of war?" Liana nodded, a grim smile touching her lips. "They took the weapon, but left the arsenal." She gestured to the remaining books on her shelf, each containing fragments of the larger puzzle. The theft confirmed what she had feared since arriving at Fort Dalen. Someone was not only one step ahead, but they were playing by her own rulebook. The alarm klaxons wailed across Fort Dalen at 3 in the morning. Dr. Liana Hallberg was already awake, hunched over her desk when the emergency lights bathed her quarters in pulsing red. She knew something was wrong before her communication device buzzed with the urgent summons. Multiple field units reporting conflicting orders. Commander Ayers barked as Liana entered the command center. His face was drawn tight with tension. "Northern Squad is mobilizing for defensive positions, while Eastern Patrol believes they're supposed to advance." Liana scanned the scrolling data on the main terminal. To everyone else, it looked like random transmission errors, but her trained eye caught the deliberate pattern immediately. This wasn't a glitch. "Pull up the original satellite relay," she requested, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. The technicians exchanged confused glances, but Ayers nodded sharply. When the raw data appeared, Liana's stomach clenched. The seemingly random errors followed a precise linguistic algorithm, one she had personally designed years ago for Echo Cipher. The pattern used homophonic substitutions in the third word of every fifth transmission, creating a shadow directive that would override standard orders. "This is intentional," she announced, fingers flying across the keyboard. "These aren't errors. They're embedded commands designed to create confusion and potentially hostile engagement between our own units." Corporal Esme Ruth appeared at her side, eyes wide. "How can you possibly know that?" "Because I wrote the playbook," Liana murmured, too focused to filter her words. Working with methodical precision, she crafted countersignals using the same encryption method, but inverted the key variables. Within minutes, she had rerouted communications through secondary channels, neutralizing the embedded commands before they could trigger a friendly fire incident. "All units stand down and await verification," Ayers ordered through the secure channel Liana had established. The tension in the room gradually dissipated as confirmations trickled in. Later, as the command center emptied, the commander approached her workstation. "That was impressive work, Hallberg." "It was my work," she replied quietly. "Someone is using my old Echo Cipher protocols." Ayers' expression hardened. "You're certain?" "The pattern signature is unmistakable. It's like recognizing your own handwriting." She closed her eyes briefly. "Someone with access to classified Echo Cipher methodologies is testing the system, seeing if anyone would recognize it." The linguist gathered her notes, the weight of realization settling heavily on her shoulders. Her past wasn't just haunting her, it was being weaponized, and whoever was behind it knew exactly what they were doing. "This wasn't a test run," she told Ayers. "It was a message, for me." The encrypted message arrived in Liana's quarters just before midnight, hidden within a requisition form for linguistics textbooks. Dr. Liana Hallberg recognized the pattern immediately. A double-encoded cipher using Slavic phonetics as its base key. Her fingers trembled slightly as she worked through the layers, a process that would have taken others days, completed in mere minutes. When the signature materialized on her notepad, she nearly dropped her pen. Latch, a ghost. A colleague she had mourned years ago after a mission in the border regions had gone catastrophically wrong. "Echo lives again," the message read. "They've named it Thresher, using your old codes, Liana, testing misinformation across 3 allied battalions. The patterns are unmistakable. Your linguistic fingerprints are all over it. The linguist sat back in her chair, the familiar weight of dread settling in her stomach. She had created those codes during her time with EchoCipher. Elegant, nearly undetectable patterns of misinformation designed to sow confusion in enemy ranks. Now someone was deploying them against their own allies. Liana crossed to her bookshelf, pulling down a weathered copy of Regional Dialects. Inside its hollowed center lay one of her cipher wheels, untouched for years. She spun it methodically, translating the coordinates Latch had included. Only you can recognize the patterns before they spread. The message continued. Thresher has already compromised communications in the northern sector. Your commander knows nothing. Trust no one. She paced her small room, mind racing. If Latch was alive, why reveal himself now? And if Thresher was using her codes, who had access to them? The intelligence officer had believed those algorithms buried with EchoCipher's termination. A knock at her door made her hastily conceal the evidence. Corporal Esme Routh stood in the hallway, holding a stack of books. "Thought you might want these back," the junior officer said, her eyes curious but warm. Liana nodded, carefully taking the volumes while keeping her expression neutral. She couldn't risk involving Esme, not with Thresher's shadow looming. The young woman had already lost her brother to these covert games. After Esme departed, Liana returned to the message. The final line chilled her. "They're watching you. Your reassignment wasn't coincidence. Fort Dalen is Thresher's testing ground, and you, old friend, are both the key and the target." She burned the message, watching the paper curl into ash. Tomorrow she would begin hunting for signs, the linguistic anomalies only she would recognize. If Thresher's reach was growing as Latch warned, the consequences would be devastating, and she alone stood between its architects and their success. Dr. Liana Halberg sat across from the base psychologist in the stark interview room, her posture relaxed despite the obvious scrutiny. This was their third session in 2 weeks. Commander Ayre's orders, ostensibly to evaluate her mental fitness for duty. "Let's discuss your time with EchoCipher," the psychologist said, pen hovering over his notepad. "Your nightmares have returned, haven't they?" Liana smiled faintly. "Interesting assumption. Did you experience similar symptoms after Operation Blackthorn?" The man's pen froze mid-stroke. "I don't recall mentioning that operation." "You didn't," she replied, watching his face pale slightly. "Just as you never mentioned your role in the linguistic conditioning trials in the northern sector 4 years ago." The psychologist set his notepad down, professional demeanor cracking. "Those files are sealed." "So were mine." Liana leaned forward. "Fascinating how language works, isn't it? The right words can open doors, or minds." Their sessions had evolved into a delicate dance. What began as interrogation disguised as therapy had transformed into something more complex. The psychologist probed for weaknesses in her psychological armor while she systematically dismantled his. "Your methods concern Commander Ayres," he said, attempting to regain control. "The way you decoded that satellite relay, it wasn't standard protocol." "Because it wasn't a standard glitch," Liana countered. "You know that." She watched him make notes, recognizing the classification markers in his shorthand. The military man was documenting far more than her mental state. "Your relationship with Corporal Ralph, is that wise given your history?" Liana's expression remained neutral, though her pulse quickened. "Esme reminds me that not everything is coded. Some connections are just human." The psychologist studied her with newfound wariness. "Your composure is remarkable for someone who's seen what you have. Or perhaps," she suggested, "it's precisely because of what I've seen." As their session ended, he closed his file with a troubled expression. "I can't determine if you're suffering from complex trauma, operating at genius-level compartmentalization, or something else entirely." Liana stood, straightening her uniform. Perhaps that's the point. Walking back to her quarters, she reflected on the shifting power dynamic. The psychologist had begun their sessions believing he was extracting information. Now he questioned whether he was the one being analyzed. She knew her file would reach Commander Ayers by evening, marked either as a valuable asset or a dangerous liability. The line between the two had always been thin in her world, where words were both weapons and shields. Liana touched her tattoo absently. The glyph that had once marked her as Echo Cipher's architect now served as a reminder. Language could build worlds or destroy them, and she had done both. The late afternoon sun slanted through the narrow window of Liana's quarters as Corporal Esme Routh helped arrange the scattered collection of books. What had begun as a casual offer to assist Dr. Liana Hallberg had turned into hours of methodical organization, with the junior officer carefully handling each weathered volume. "I never took you for such a bibliophile," Esme remarked, lifting a dog-eared copy of Dostoevsky. As she adjusted its position on the makeshift shelf, the book slipped from her hands, landing with an unusually hollow thud. The linguist froze, her eyes meeting Esme's. After a moment of tense silence, Liana nodded slightly, giving permission. Curious, the corporal opened the cover to discover the interior had been meticulously hollowed out, creating a hidden compartment that housed a small brass cipher wheel and handwritten notes in multiple languages. "Check the Hemingway," Liana said quietly. Esme pulled down another volume, finding it similarly transformed. This one containing miniature encryption devices nestled between pages of annotated intelligence reports. Book after book revealed the same pattern, each a vessel for secrets, each containing fragments of operations long buried. "Every text here is a weapon," Liana explained, running her fingers along the spine of an ancient military history. "Some battles are fought with words, not bullets. These hold the records of wars nobody knows were won or lost." The corporal sat on the edge of the narrow bed, suddenly understanding the weight of what she was witnessing. "Is this why they fear you? Because you've preserved what was meant to be destroyed?" Liana rolled up her sleeve, revealing the black glyph that had so disturbed Commander Ayers. "This isn't just a tattoo. It's a key, the final layer of encryption that makes these fragments useful." "Like a living codex," Esme whispered, her admiration for the older woman deepening even as a flicker of apprehension crossed her face. "Exactly." The intelligence officer carefully replaced a volume on the shelf. "Knowledge preserved can protect as much as it threatens. That's why Echo Cipher wanted everything burned, including those who carried the memories." Esme considered her own position, the sister of a man who died in service to programs like these, now helping preserve their secrets. She realized with sudden clarity that by simply being in this room, she had crossed a threshold. The young officer was no longer just a friend. She had become part of the very web of secrets she'd been trying to understand. "Does Ayers know about these?" she asked, gesturing to the library of hollow sentinels. Liana's smile held no warmth. "Why do you think I'm still alive?" Commander Ayers slid the invitation across his desk with studied nonchalance. "Dr. Hallberg, your expertise has been requested at the Allied Intelligence Strategy Summit next week." His fingers lingered on the envelope's edge, betraying his unease. Liana took the cream-colored envelope, noting its weight and texture. Too formal for a routine meeting. "A summit? That's unusual for someone of my clearance level." "Your clearance has been adjusted," Ayers replied, avoiding her gaze. "The Joint Chiefs believe your linguistic background could provide valuable perspective on emerging communication protocols." Back in her quarters, Liana spread the documents across her desk. The summit agenda outlined discussions on linguistic pattern recognition and cultural infiltration methodologies, harmless-sounding topics that set off alarm bells in her mind. Then she saw it. Embedded in the watermark of the summit's logo was a familiar glyph, the same symbol etched into her forearm. Her hands trembled as she reached for her cipher wheel, hidden inside her hollowed copy of Dostoevsky. Working through the night, she decoded the supplementary materials, translating seemingly innocuous phrases into their true meaning. Adaptive language algorithms became psychological manipulation protocols. Cultural integration strategies translated to covert linguistic warfare. Page after page revealed the truth. Echo cipher wasn't dead. It was evolving. The next morning, Liana found Esme in the mess hall. "I need your help," she whispered, sliding a notebook across the table. The corporal glanced down at the coded notes, her eyes widening. "Is this what I think it is?" Esme asked, voice barely audible above the clatter of trays. Liana nodded. "They're building an AI system based on my old algorithms. Echo cipher with machine learning capabilities. Imagine disinformation that adapts in real time to cultural and linguistic shifts. Who's behind it? That's what we need to find out. The summit will gather everyone involved." Liana tapped the invitation. "And they've just invited the one person who can recognize their methods." Esme's expression hardened. "My brother always said Echo cipher was never truly shut down, just rebranded." He was right. Liana traced the outline of her tattoo through her sleeve. This symbol was our original cipher key. Now, it's their logo. They're not even hiding it anymore, just disguising it as innovation. As they parted ways, Commander Ayres watched from across the mess hall, his communication device discreetly recording their interaction. His face betrayed nothing, but his knuckles whitened around his coffee mug. The summit was 1 week away. 7 days to prepare for a confrontation years in the making, with an enemy using weapons Liana herself had designed. The red alert klaxon blared through the communications wing just as Dr. Liana Hallberg was finishing her shift. Her trained ear caught something in the transmission pattern, a deliberate stutter in the Morse code that shouldn't have been there. "It's not a drill," she whispered to Corporal Esme Ralph, who had been helping catalog intercepted messages. The linguist pulled Esme into a vacant monitoring station, away from curious eyes. "Listen to the cadence," Liana instructed, adjusting the frequency dial. "They're calling it a training exercise, but the embedded pattern is pure thresher." Esme leaned closer, her brow furrowing. "I hear it now. The double clicks between phrases. That's not standard protocol." They worked methodically, Liana translating while her ally transcribed. What emerged was chilling, a coordinated misinformation campaign disguised as routine communications, designed to send 3 Allied units into collision courses along the border. They're testing how effectively they can manipulate field operations through language alone, Liana explained. Setting up an improvised decryption station using chess pieces to represent the affected units. The Knight and Bishop, representing the Northern Patrol and Reconnaissance Team, would be maneuvered into direct conflict if the false intelligence wasn't intercepted. The women worked through the night, their small desk lamp casting long shadows across walls lined with reference books. Esme proved remarkably adept, her literature background giving her an intuitive grasp of linguistic patterns that surprised even Liana. "My brother used to play these word games," she admitted. "I never realized he was training for something like this." By dawn, they had identified 7 separate transmission points. Using a communication device Liana had modified, they began broadcasting counter-signals on stolen frequencies, neutralizing Thresher's commands with carefully crafted linguistic nullifiers. This isn't just a test, Liana realized as the scope became clear. It's a full-scale field trial. They're measuring response times, adaptation rates, everything they need to deploy the system globally. The junior officers stared at their makeshift map, chess pieces now surrounded by concentric circles of dictionaries and codebooks. How deep does this go? Who's authorizing this? Liana's fingers traced the inked glyph on her forearm. That's what terrifies me. This operation has multiple command signatures, military, intelligence, even diplomatic channels. Thresher isn't rogue, it's institutional. As morning light filtered through the blinds, they intercepted the final transmission, a stand-down order. The test had been compromised, but the data collected was deemed sufficient for phase advancement. "We stopped it this time," Esme whispered. "No," Liana corrected grimly. "We just showed them what to fix in version 2. The whispers about Thresher rippled through Fort Dalen like a virus, infecting every conversation with doubt. Liana Halberg noticed the subtle shifts, how officers would fall silent when she entered the mess hall, how intelligence staff watched her with wary eyes. Even those who had begun to trust her were retreating, uncertain which version of the linguist was real. "You're doing it again," Corporal Esme Ruth said quietly, sliding into the seat across from Liana. "That thing with your fingers, tapping patterns." Liana looked down at her hands, surprised to find them moving in the familiar rhythm of an old echo-ciphered dissociation protocol. She hadn't realized she was doing it. "It helps me remember," she admitted, voice barely audible over the clatter of trays. "There are gaps, things they made us forget. The patterns trigger memories." The linguist closed her eyes, whispering a sequence of phonemes that seemed nonsensical but followed precise linguistic rules. Each sound unlocked fragments, faces, coordinates, operations she'd helped design. The memories surfaced like drowning victims, gasping and distorted. "You're scaring people," Esme said, reaching across to still Liana's hands. "Commander Ayres asked me if you were stable enough for field operations." The revelation hung between them, heavy with implication. Liana studied her young ally's face, searching for deception. "And what did you tell him?" Inside was a surveillance photo. Inside was a surveillance photo that made Liana's blood freeze. Esme's brother, alive and in uniform, directing a Thresher field exercise. "You knew," Liana whispered, sliding the photo across the table. Esme's eyes widened, then filled with tears. "I suspected. He contacted me last month, said he was working on something important, something that would change everything." She swallowed hard. "I thought he died in that echo cipher experiment." "He was listed as deceased in all official records. Just like you were supposed to be," Esme countered, her voice hardening. "How many other ghosts are walking around this base, Liana?" The question lingered as Liana watched her only friend struggle with divided loyalties. The brother she mourned versus the woman who had become her mentor. The military she served versus the shadow operations it harbored. "I need to know where you stand," Liana finally said, her fingers unconsciously returning to their rhythmic tapping. "Because tomorrow, everything changes." Esme stared at the photo of her brother, then at Liana's tattooed forearm. "I stand with the truth," she said finally, "whatever it costs." But as they parted ways, both women knew that in this game, truth was the most dangerous currency of all. The pieces fell into place like a complex cipher finally decoded. Dr. Liana Halberg sat alone in her quarters, surrounded by open books and scattered notes, as the truth revealed itself through disconnected fragments. Her tattoo, the black-inked glyph that had caused Commander Ayres to blanch that first day, wasn't merely an identifier. Running her fingers over the raised lines, she understood now it functioned as a phonetic cipher key, designed to unlock specific patterns in the echo cipher methodology that even its creators couldn't fully control. They needed a human component, she whispered to herself, a variable that couldn't be replicated. The soldiers who had jeered at her books hadn't been random bullies. Their mockery was calculated, a surveillance tactic. Liana had intercepted communications, confirming they reported her every movement, her reading habits, even her conversations in the mess hall. The linguist smiled grimly at the realization. Those same soldiers now avoided her gaze whenever she passed. Most revealing was what she'd uncovered about Ayres. The commander's personnel file, accessed through Esme's security clearance, showed redacted sections that Liana's trained eye could reconstruct. Before commanding Fort Dalen, he had served as a handler for echo cipher operatives, including Liana herself, though neither had recognized the other initially. "You were never meant to remember me," he had admitted yesterday, his voice low across his desk. The compartmentalization was deliberate, but truth crystallized with brutal clarity. Her reassignment to Fort Dalen hadn't been coincidence or bureaucratic error. A network of retired Echo Cipher operatives, fearing what Thresher might become, had orchestrated her placement. They believed only she could recognize and dismantle the program before it spread beyond control. Esme entered without knocking, her face tense. "The communication logs you wanted," she said, placing a data drive on the desk. "It goes higher than we thought." Liana nodded. "Thresher has roots throughout the command structure. Even heirs answers to someone." The corporal leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "My brother would have hated this, using language as a weapon." "Language has always been a weapon," Liana replied, closing one of her hollowed books. "The difference is who wields it, and why." Outside, the base continued its routines, shifts changing, vehicles moving across the compound, orders being followed. But beneath this military choreography, invisible lines of power and conspiracy stretched like a web, with Fort Dalen at its center and Liana caught in the middle. She had been brought here to unravel Thresher. Instead, she was unmasking the entire command. The abandoned storage bunker at the far edge of Fort Dalen reeked of mildew and forgotten supplies. Liana Hallberg checked her watch, 3 minutes past the agreed time. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold air as she waited, fingers tracing the outline of the tattoo beneath her sleeve. A shadow moved behind the stacked crates. "You still count seconds in your head?" came a familiar voice. "Some habits never change." Liana's chest tightened as Latch stepped into the dim light. The man she'd mourned, the colleague whose death she'd carried like a stone, stood before her, very much alive. "You warned me about Thresher," she said evenly, masking her shock. "Why warn me about your own creation?" Latch smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "To see if you'd keep our code of silence or break it." He circled her slowly, appraising. "You passed the test. You always were the best of us." "This isn't a test," Liana countered. "You're using my algorithms, my linguistic patterns. People could die." "People always die," he replied, leaning against a crate. "But with Thresher, we control which ones and why. The program is everything Echo Cipher should have been. Precise, adaptive, untraceable." The linguist felt ice forming in her stomach. The man who had once been her warning system was now the architect of the very danger she fought against. "Join us," Latch continued, his voice softening. "We need your expertise. The system responds to your patterns because you designed the foundation. It recognizes you as its creator. And if I refuse?" His expression hardened. "Then I can't protect you or your new friend. Corporal Routh has quite the aptitude for our work, doesn't she?" Liana's fists clenched involuntarily. The mention of Esme sent a protective surge through her body. "You wouldn't—" "I would," Latch cut her off. "This is bigger than personal loyalties. The intelligence community is evolving, with or without your blessing." He slid a small communication device across the table between them. 3 days. That's how long the offer stands." As he turned to leave, Liana called after him. "You once told me our greatest responsibility was to protect language from becoming a weapon." Latch paused at the doorway. "And now I control the arsenal." He disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the echo of his footsteps. Alone in the bunker, Liana stared at the device. Her former ally had become her greatest threat. The betrayal cut deep, but it also crystallized her resolve. She would dismantle Thresher, even if it meant destroying the last remnants of her former life. The grand hall of the summit venue buzzed with anticipation as military brass and intelligence officials from across Allied forces gathered. Dr. Liana Hallberg sat rigidly in the third row, her fingers unconsciously tracing the outline of her tattoo beneath her sleeve. Commander Ayres had positioned her strategically, visible enough to be noted, hidden enough to observe. The keynote speaker, a silver-haired general with a practiced smile, approached the podium. As he began his address about linguistic innovation in modern warfare, Liana's trained ear caught the subtle patterns woven into his speech, familiar cadences and strategic pauses that made her blood run cold. "He's using echo cipher patterns," she whispered to Esme, who sat beside her taking notes. The corporal glanced up, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. The linguist's mind raced, decoding in real time. Each seemingly innocuous phrase contained embedded commands and operational protocols. This wasn't a proposal. It was an activation sequence for Echo Cipher 2.0, now rebranded as Thresher and enhanced with artificial intelligence. When the speaker proudly displayed the new program's logo on the screen, gasps rippled through the audience. There it was, her glyph, incorporated into the design, a perversion of her own work. "They're using my system," Liana murmured, rising slowly from her seat. The movement drew eyes, including Ayres, whose slight nod gave her unexpected permission. She approached the stage with measured steps, interrupting the presentation. "May I add context to this innovation?" she asked, her voice carrying an authority that silenced objections. Taking the microphone, she rolled up her sleeve, revealing the black-inked symbol. "This isn't just a tattoo. It's an unfinished linguistic system I designed, one with a fatal flaw." The room fell silent as she began speaking in a language no one recognized, except the AI system processing the presentation. On the screens around them, code began scrolling wildly, predictive algorithms failing as they attempted to process the incomplete language system. "The flaw," she continued calmly, as chaos erupted around them, "is that it creates a recursive loop when fully implemented. It was never meant to be completed." Latch stood from his seat, face contorted with rage, but security personnel were already moving toward him, as the system crash revealed his unauthorized access codes on every screen. The summit dissolved into pandemonium as Thresher's control grid collapsed, exposing the rogue operation's full scope. Military police flooded the hall, detaining key figures as Liana stood unwavering at the podium, her quiet composure finally weaponized against those who had weaponized her work. Esme reached her side, eyes wide with vindication. "You've dismantled it," she whispered. "No," Liana replied, watching as the screens went dark. "We have." The morning after the summit collapsed, Dr. Liana Hallberg stood at attention in Commander Ayres' office, her posture rigid despite her exhaustion. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the medals and commendations laid out on his desk, honors meant for her. "The Joint Chiefs are impressed," Ayres said, sliding a folder across the polished surface. "Full reinstatement, promotion, your own division, everything you deserve after exposing Thresher." Liana glanced at the folder, but made no move to take it. "I didn't do it for recognition." The commander leaned forward, his voice lowering. "You've earned this, Hallberg. Your work saved countless lives, prevented an intelligence catastrophe." He tapped the folder. "This is your chance to rebuild Echo Cipher the right way." "That's precisely why I'm declining," she replied, her voice steady. "There is no right way to weaponize language. We both know that." Ayres' expression hardened. "Then what? You'll just walk away? After everything?" Liana's fingers absently traced the outline of her tattoo through her sleeve. "Not walking away. Changing direction." 3 days later, Corporal Esme Routh found Liana in the archives, surrounded by stacks of dusty manuscripts and digital transcription equipment. The linguist had converted the forgotten basement into a makeshift laboratory of language. "They're saying you've lost your mind," Esme said, setting down 2 cups of coffee. "Turning down a general star to hide in the basement." Liana accepted the cup with a grateful nod. "I'm not hiding. I'm building something different." She gestured to the manuscripts. "These are dialects from border regions, languages nearly extinct. I'm documenting them, creating translation protocols for peacekeeping operations." Instead of weaponizing them, Esme observed. Exactly. Liana pulled up a digital interface showing linguistic mapping across conflict zones. Language should bridge divides, not create them. What Thresher tried to do, what I once helped Echo Cipher do, was pervert that purpose. Esme studied her mentor's face, noting the lines of fatigue but also the clarity in her eyes. The brass thinks you're throwing away your career. Let them. Liana smiled faintly. This is my penance, and my hope. As weeks passed, the basement archives transformed. Military personnel seeking linguistic assistance began appearing at Liana's door. Border Patrol units requested dialect training. Humanitarian missions sought her expertise for negotiation protocols. Without fanfare or recognition, she built what Echo Cipher never could, a system that preserved rather than exploited, that connected rather than divided. Her refusal of honors became, in its quiet way, her greatest achievement. The archives had become Liana's sanctuary in the months following Thresher's collapse. Surrounded by forgotten texts and classified documents, Dr. Halberg found peace in cataloging the very weapons she once wielded. The basement room smelled of paper and time, illuminated by soft lamps that cast long shadows across her workstation. She looked up at the sound of footsteps. Corporal Esme Rauff stood in the doorway, her uniform crisp despite the late hour, holding a weathered copy of The Art of War. The young officer approached hesitantly, placing the book on the desk between them. I finished my annotations, Esme said, her voice barely above a whisper. Liana opened the book, fingers tracing the margins filled with elegant script. The linguist smiled as she recognized the hybrid cipher they had developed together. Part echo remnant, part innovation, wholly their own. It was a language built from fragments of dead dialects and mathematical patterns, comprehensible only to them. Your brother would be proud, Liana murmured, noting how Esme had integrated elements of her sibling's handwriting style into the code. This is beautiful work. Commander Ayers asked about you again today, the corporal said, settling into the chair opposite. He still doesn't understand why you chose this instead of reinstatement. Liana's hand unconsciously moved to her forearm, tracing the outline of her tattoo through the fabric of her sleeve. Some weapons should remain silent. The archives need a guardian who understands what's at stake. Outside, the base hummed with activity. Radio chatter. Vehicles moving across the compound. The constant vigilance of a military installation. But here, in this underground room, two women had created something the intelligence apparatus couldn't quantify. Esme reached across the desk, her fingers brushing against the older woman's hand. I've been approved for the linguistics division. They're letting me stay. The news settled between them like a promise. What had begun as an unlikely friendship forged in crisis had evolved into something more powerful. A partnership of minds committed to ensuring that language remained a bridge rather than a weapon. We'll need more books, Liana said, gesturing to the shelves of hollowed texts that had once contained her secrets. I already started collecting them, Esme replied with a smile. As twilight deepened outside Fort Dalen, the two women bent their heads over ancient texts and modern codes, building something new from the ashes of Echo Cipher. Their quiet revolution would leave no casualties, only understanding. In a world obsessed with power, they had discovered that true strength lay not in the words spoken aloud, but in those carefully preserved in silence, ink, and the tongue's history had failed to erase.